In this video, we are going to learn about demand and supply shifters. Shifters are basically the factors that causes the demand and supply curve to shift to the left or to the right. So let's first look at demand shifters. But before we proceed, please keep in mind that demand curves are downward sloping and supply curves are upward sloping. So our first shifter is income. Now the effect of changes in income on demand curve depends on the nature of a good. So this depends on the nature of good. So we have two types of good. First is normal good. The demand for normal good increases when income increases. So demand increases when income increases and vice versa. Okay. Second type of good is inferior good. So demand for inferior good decreases when income increases. So demand decreases when income increases and vice versa. So a few examples of inferior goods are second-hand stuff or unhealthy food items like instant noodles. Okay, so for the normal good, demand increases, which means the demand curve will shift to the right, and for inferior good, demand decreases, so the demand curve will shift to the left. Our next factor is population. So as the population of an economy changes, the potential buyers of a particular good also changes, right? For example, what happens to the demand for diapers? Demand for diapers if birth rate drops. If birth rate drops. So there will be a decrease in demand, right? Because there will be less number of children. So the demand will decrease, which means demand curve will shift to the left. Okay, shifts left. Our next factor is price of substitutes. So two goods are substitutes. Two goods are substitutes if price of one good and demand for other good always move in the same direction. Always move in the same direction. What I mean by this is, let's take an example. So what happens to the demand for tea if the price of coffee increases? So whenever there is the increase in price of coffee, people will shift to the less expensive good, right? For example, tea in this case. So the demand for tea will increase. So here in this example, tea and coffee are substitutes. Okay. So the definition basically states that the price of one good and the demand for other good always move in the same direction. As we saw in the example, when the price of coffee increases, when the price of coffee increases, the demand for tea increases. Okay. Similarly, um, Pepsi and Coca-Cola, Pepsi and Coca-Cola can be substitutes. Okay. So whenever there is increase in the price of Pepsi, there will be increase in the demand for Coca-Cola. So Pepsi and Coca-Cola are substitutes. So in the first example, demand for tea increases, which means the demand curve will shift to the right. Okay. Now our next factor is price of complements. So complements are basically opposite of substitute. So two goods are complements if a decrease, or let me define in the similar way as substitutes. If price of one good and demand of other good move in the opposite direction. Opposite direction. For example, what happens to the demand for SUV? Demand for SUV when gasoline gets more expensive. When gasoline gets more expensive. So when the price of gasoline rises, the demand for SUV will decrease, right? Because this is the vehicle that runs on the gasoline. Okay. So the demand curve will shift to the left. Now let's look at our next factor, expectations. So whenever there is increase in the expected price of one good, okay, expected price for a good in the future, so whenever there is increase in the expected price for a good in the future, people will will want to consume the good today, right? So there will be increase in the current demand for the good. So increase in the current demand for the good. Similarly, whenever there is a decrease in the expected price for a good in the future, then there will be decrease in the current demand for the good, because people want to consume more in the future, because they know that the prices will be lesser in the future. So why do they consume now? Why do they consume more today? Okay. So whenever there is decrease in the demand curve will shift to the left, and if there is increase in demand curve will shift to the right. And our last factor is tastes and preferences. So taste and preferences are basically subjective and will vary among consumers. And there is one more thing, like seasonal changes also impacts this factor, because for example, for ice cream, the demand is higher in summer than winter, right? So in that case, demand curve will shift to the right. And for another example could be, um, face masks were really in demand during COVID time. So demand curve shifts again to the right. Okay. So these are a few examples of the taste and preferences. Now let's move on to the supply factors. So supply shifters. So our first factor is technological innovations. So whenever there is technological innovations, marginal cost of production becomes lower. Marginal cost of production becomes lower, and this leads to the increase in supply. So increases supply, and supply curve will shift to the right. So supply curve shifts right. Okay. Our next factor is input prices. So inputs are basically the goods which are used to produce our final output, final goods. So whenever there is a decrease in the price of input, the marginal cost to produce the good also decreases, right? And this will lead to the increase in supply. So a decrease in the price of an input decreases the marginal cost and increases supply and vice versa is also true. Okay. For example, what will happen to the supply of smartphones if the chips are cheaper? If the chips, this is electronics chips, if the chips are cheaper, so the supply will increase, right? Because the quantity that that is going to be used to produce the final output, the price is lower, so the supply of final output will increase. So in this case, supply curve will shift to the right, shifts right. Another example is what will happen to the supply of electric cars if batteries are more expensive. So if batteries are more expensive, there will be decrease in supply, right? Our third factor is expectations. So the argument is basically very similar to the demand shifter. So whenever there is increase in the expected price for a good in the future, the current supply of the good decreases, right? So an increase in the expected price for a good in the future decreases current supply of the good, and vice versa is also true. Okay. Given that the good is storable, good should be durable, otherwise good may get damaged and there is no point of selling it in the future. Okay. Our last factor is entry or exit of producers. So entry implies more sellers in the market. Entry implies more sellers in the market, and exit implies fewer sellers in the market. So whenever there is more sellers, there is increase in supply. Increase in supply. And whenever there is fewer sellers, there is decrease in supply. Okay. For example, what will happen to the supply for marijuana in California if the drug is legalized for recreational use? So in this case, there will be more number of legal drug store to sell marijuana, right? So there will be more supply of marijuana in the market. Okay. So these are the factors that causes the demand and supply curves to shift either to the left or to the right. Okay. Okay, so now let's consider a situation when there is increase in price and a decrease in quantity. So I have two graphs here. In both of these graphs, you can notice that the quantity has decreased from Q0 to Q1 and price has increased from P0 to P1. In the second graph, you can see that the demand curve is relatively steeper, but in both of these graphs, the supply curve has shifted to the left, and in the first graph, the demand curve has shifted to the right, and in the second, demand curve has shifted to the left. So from these two graphs, we can conclude that it is likely to be decrease in supply. Okay, likely to be decrease in supply, but we're not sure about the demand. Not sure about demand because there is different shifts in both of these graphs, but the supply curve has shifted to the left in both of these graphs. Okay, so due to the steepness, different steepness in both of these graphs, we have achieved the same situation, that is increase in price and decrease in quantity, and that's why we cannot say anything about the demand. Okay, now let's consider the second situation when there is increase in price and increase in quantity. So again, I have two graphs here, and in both of these graphs, the quantity has increased from Q0 to Q1 and price has increased from P0 to P1. And now here, in these two graphs, in the second graphs especially, the supply curve is relatively steeper, but in both of these graphs, the demand curve has shifted to the right, but the shift in the supply curve is different in both of these graphs. In the first, supply curve has shifted to the left. In the second, supply curve has shifted to the right. So same as above, we cannot say anything about the supply curve. Okay, cannot say anything about supply, but it is likely to be increase in demand. Increase in demand, because in both of these graphs the demand curve has shifted to the right, so it should be increase in demand. So from these two situations we can conclude that whenever there is the change in price and quantity in the opposite direction, we are not sure about the demand, we cannot say anything about the demand, but there it is likely to be decrease in supply. And whenever there is the change in price and quantity in the same direction, we cannot say anything about the supply, and it is likely to be increase in demand. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next video I'll cover some other topics of macroeconomics. So thanks so much for watching this video.